Welcome, adventurers, to the Recall to Adventure podcast, where we're celebrating 25 years of Islands of Adventure. We'll be sitting down with some of the original show producers, animators, engineers, and designers for Universal Orlando Resort's Second Gate. We're your hosts, Maya
and Holly.
And now, for this episode, we're joined by Ben Lovelace, ride engineer for the amazing adventures of Spider-Man. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to join you and talk about what we did in the past to make it such a great ride.
So to start, what was some of your background? How did you get involved in the theme park industry?
I got out of engineering school and I said I would not work on weapons of war or carnival rides because I was afraid that if I did something wrong, somebody would get hurt and I would not be able to live with myself after that. As it turned out, I ended up working on things very close to nuclear weapons. And then I started working for Universal, which is a glorified carnival ride. And so I pretty much rationalized that. I felt experienced enough to handle it, right or wrongly. My first job was designing deep diving equipment, including deep diving submarines down in Riviera Beach. I did that for 5 years. And then I was thinking I could start my own business and make lots of money. And I did that for 7 years. Built all kinds of design and built all kinds of heavy equipment for the utility industry, also for the underwater industry. And then there was what's called the savings and loan. I don't know, it wasn't a disaster, but it was a breakdown in the savings and loan part of our economy. And there was a big recession and I ended up losing my business. It so happened that was the same time that Universal opened up the original park. And the only ride that worked the first day was Jaws. And they kept it open for 30 days and then they shut it down. Friends of mine had done some work for the park. And since I was thrashing about trying to figure out what to do, Universal hired me to work on Earthquake Ride to get it so that it was reliable and they could count on it working every day. And so that was my first job. Is by accident that I got into that business. And it was a resounding success. It worked very much better than it did before. And at the end of that, I immediately was laid off because that was the end of my project. I went back to the submarine business for a little while. And they decided to do Jaws the second time. And they hired me back to manage the shark animation vendor, who at the time was Eastport International. And before the job was over, they got bought out by Oceaneering. And so I was managing people that are now working for Oceaneering to build all the shark animation. They did all the design work, all the heavy lifting, as it were, making all the parts and things like that. And I was just in the background going, why don't you do it this way? Or what do you think about this? Or why are you doing it that way? But eventually the ride got built and it was a rounding success. And Universal asked me to be the ride manager for all of Islands of Adventure, which I said I would do. And at that point in time, it was me trying to decide what vendor could make this ride and develop specs for what the creative people, the artistic people would come up with, crazy ideas they might come up with. And they had some previous experience with building Jurassic Park out in California. Some things didn't work so well. So we wanted to make the new park, make sure it worked better. And so we changed some of the specs. There was only so much land available to build the rides. And so you have to take the theoretical, how far does it take to decelerate a boat? How much run out do you need so that people don't get hurt? And we have to explain that to the art people, and then they start drawing the park. And so there's different people that work on the concepts of the rides, and other people work on the master planning, which is where do the rides go in the park? Will they fit there? Will we have room for other attractions in the future? And those things get shown to upper management at some point, and upper management shows it to people that are the money backers. And then they say, let's go forward, let's build this thing, because they didn't really know whether they were going to say okay or not. But it involved all the rides in the park. Where were we going to buy the rides? And so we came up with a strategy where we would try to not buy too many rides from any one vendor, which was one of the problems that they had at the original park. And so we had our top 3 vendors for each ride. And as it turned out, it went that way. They vended rides out to most of the vendors that were in the top 3. Some they found other vendors to do the work. But once they decided to fund the park, they divided a technical people up into different lands. So I was in charge of superhero land from a ride and show perspective. And then they had the other lands, they had people assigned to be in charge of those lands from a ride and show perspective, from the technical standpoint. So at that point in time, because there's money involved, lots of money involved, it starts to get more political. In the beginning, it's just, oh, how do you build a ride? What kind of show would be a good show? Who likes it? How much room does it take? And then as the project progresses, people understand that they're going to drop a bunch of money on this thing. I want to be a part of it. Lots of people start getting involved with how are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? And we did have people that they hired a bunch of people from Disney, and we had people from Universal, and we had people from not Disney and not Universal, and different people have different ideas about how to do things. And we haggled out how to build things. And sometimes we'd have some prototypes made and they maybe worked or didn't work, and we'd modify what we were doing and go forward with some other idea.
So, how did you get started on Spider-Man?
Spider-Man at the beginning was going to be a omni-mover like Haunted Mansion. It was just going to be a simple omni-mover that went around. And at the same time, Disney came out with Indiana Jones ride, and Universal, the guy that was running Universal at the time, the theme park division, was a guy named Jay Stein. And he was all about going faster, going higher, louder, bigger fire effects than anything Disney had. And so everything we did in the park was a little bit higher than Disney, a little bit further than Disney. And they decided that the Spider-Man attraction was going to be something bigger and better than Indiana Jones set the bar higher than what they had envisioned. And so their criteria was they wanted to be 3D like our Terminator show attraction that was already very successful, and as dynamic as our Back to the Future attraction. About that time, I was put in charge of Spider-Man solely. I had some other responsibilities too, but that was my main responsibility, to make Spider-Man work and be the kind of ride that they wanted. So at that time, the creative people, it's a whole different deal. The sky's the limit. I don't remember being in any meetings where they talked about budget. They just wanted this to be the best ride ever. I understood that. I understood that dynamics had to be as strong as Back to the Future. Back to the Future was a hydraulic-based, motion-based, and everybody was against hydraulics for many reasons. One is if you start leaking hydraulics on the floor, any friction drives that you have maybe don't work anymore. You could have problems with the electrical equipment that gets sprayed with hydraulics. It could be hot. It could be dangerous. There was a big desire to use electric equipment. I found several companies that maybe were capable of doing a Spider-Man ride, but one really stood out. Its company's name is Moog. They built aircraft actuators, electric aircraft actuators. And they were the fastest, strongest electric actuators that I could find at the time. And they were a big company, so they could do a large project. And they were the ones that we eventually contracted to do the ride vehicle. The first order of business was to build a prototype vehicle, and they also needed to design an actuator. They did not have an actuator off the shelf that would do the performance that we wanted. And what I tried to come up with was, what is the speed, the force, the distance that you would need in Back to the Future, and build that electrically? And so we had some basic force parameters to go with, acceleration, speeds. Can you guys build an actuator to do this? And they came up with an actuator that pretty much did that. And so the motion base has 6 of these actuators on it, and they had experience building aircraft motion bases, and they'd also had experience building electric motion bases for the entertainment industry, for malls and things like that. This was beyond what they had done. And so they built a test stand that tested this actuator to extreme limits, up and down, up and up and down, thousands of cycles to prove that their design was good. And then they built a prototype vehicle with a pinch drive that would drive it around the track. And they built a prototype vehicle that people could sit in, and upper management came up there. We had children ride the ride, and this just ride around in a building to see if they could see over the front, see if they could deal with the accelerations or how the lap bars were made and stuff. We just did some prototypical things to simulate the ride as best we could. And everybody was like, okay, this looks like this might work. And they gave us the go ahead and build real vehicles after that. One of the early arguments that we had was, what kind of drive system should you come up with? Our Disney group, They wanted everything under the floor. If you go to Disney, a lot of things are under the floor. You don't see any track per se. A slot and all the equipment that's running the ride vehicle around is under the floor. And the floor is complicated in itself because each piece of floor has a panel that you can access the track and other things underneath of it. Hard to work on, hard to maintain, expensive. And I was arguing for a plain pinch drive, piece of metal, tires that ride on it. And there's a bunch of pushback on that in the beginning. But fortunately, the creative guys came around and they said, but the people never see the track. What difference does it make? When you get on the ride vehicle, as soon as it gets into the show, it tilts up a little bit and you never really see the ride. You never see the track. You don't see the bus bars. You don't see all the stuff that's on there. But it saves a ton of money and it allows maintenance people to walk around, inspect the track, inspect the bus bar to build reliability into the ride. So that's how we ended up getting to the pinch drive system. And Moog was able to build a very good one that had the acceleration that we wanted, the stopping power, no matter how much weight's in the vehicle. So they did the combined drive and motion base, the 6 degrees of freedom motion base to make the basic ride system work. So now we've pretty much got a decent ride vehicle. The thing we didn't have was the vehicle itself. There was some work by Moog to try to figure out how to do that, and they had a lot on their plate. Schedule was coming along, and Universal decided that we would manage the ride vehicle on our own through the technical staff that we had, the vendors that we knew. And so we vended out the sides of the vehicle up to a company in Iowa, of all places. We vended out the floor to a composite company over in Melbourne that was an expert at high-end composites and structural analysis. I helped with the lap bar design and with the door opening mechanisms. We built those. We designed and built those with some local designers that we hired to design it. And I helped with this analysis of how big things should be. And locking mechanism on the door is strange, but it does the job, I think, of what was intended. We had some big arguments about the door. There were some, I'm going to say, Disney people that didn't want a door that opened overhead. They wanted sliding doors. I personally thought that was more complicated and wouldn't be as reliable, and we argued around about it. The creative guys, when you get into the ride vehicle, they don't want it to look like a regular car, and I can't tell you what they're thinking, whether they like the overhead door concept or the sliding door concept better or whatever, but I think they had something to do with choosing the overhead door concept, and that's what we ended up designing. And then we had to test it, build it, test it, cycle it, all those things to prove that concept would work. Same thing with the lap bars. People are contained. Each end, the walls of the car are high. It prevents people from seeing other things they're not supposed to see. It also keeps them in the car. The lap bar, even though there's big people and little people in the row of seats, the lap bar does a good job keeping everybody where they're supposed to be. And they're monitored all the time with closed circuit TVs. It's a pretty good vehicle for containing people, and the top is open. They can see above and somewhat in front, and the vehicle, it can be tilted on the motion base to point at what creative staff wants them to look at. One other feature that I think is a signature feature is a 360-degree rotation of the cabin. They wanted a rotation of the cabin for some part of the show, and originally, I'm going to say the Disney people, they wanted to do a rotation mechanism that was only so many degrees instead of 360 degrees, both directions. They just wanted to go, let's say 270. I don't even remember what the number was, 270. So you can go 270 one way and you go 270 the other way. And people thought that would be cheaper than doing 360. And my thing was it's easier to do 360 because it's just a gear and a motor that drives the gear, which rotates on a bearing. The thing flies around, and use proximity sensors to monitor where it's at. And there's an encoder on the motor that tells you where the motor's at, which tells you where the vehicle's at. So there's no real reason to do it 270 because that involves shocks and other technical things to prevent the thing from being damaged if you run into the end. In the 360 situation, there is no end. You just can keep going, and eventually it slows down and stops. Nobody gets hurt. Plus, and in my counterintuitive mind, if there was ever a ride in the future where you wanted 360, you got it. There's no need to redesign it. It's there. And so that ride vehicle, it has pretty much as much acceleration on a 6-off motion base that people can deal with. It gives you the 360-degree rotation, the height that it can go up. I ask people when they get off the ride, how far up did it go? I don't know, 20 feet. So it went about, I think, 18 inches. That number might be wrong, but it doesn't go up very far. But it's the jerk, the initiation of the going up, and then the film takes over from there. You think you're going up, but you're really not. And so that ride vehicle, in combination with good film, whether it's 3D or not, can pretty much provide you whatever sensation you want to actually have. That's how we ended up with where we are. And then the funny part was, after that, the creative people decided to use the 360-degree function and halfway through the ride, where the ride vehicle gets out of control and goes around several turns. They love that. They like that. So I think the ride vehicle mechanically is pretty good and does everything they wanted it to do. I'll stop there and you can ask me another question.
What was it like working with the actual story department to really solidify this story with the ride system you were working on? And where did the limitations come from that? Do you think you were limited story-wise or mechanically wise? Like, which side had to give the most?
In all the rides that I worked on originally, and also Spider-Man specifically, I felt the ride engineers and the show engineers too, we can talk about that a little bit, the movies, all worked very well with the creative department as far as trying to provide them what they were asking for, because their concept of the ride is what makes it great. And so if we can simulate that in a safe manner for people to ride a ride and get the experience that the creative department envisions, as far as I'm concerned, that's our job. And unless there's some physical reason that prevents you from doing it the way they want to do it, they would usually go, okay, understand that, but you got to go to that limit. But the things they were asking for were possible.
You brought up the 3D of it. Were there any challenges getting that to work with the ride at all?
I don't know all the details, but when the ride vehicle's moving and you're doing 3D, there are things associated with the film that you have to modify so it doesn't look weird or people don't get sick or something. And I don't know the details they went through, but they simulated doing 3D film with the moving vehicle and how they had to change the film to make all that work. There was one word that they used called squinching, but that was one of the key things to make the whole film work with the ride. The other piece was they wanted very high definition, so we went to basically 60 millimeter film that was run vertically, 2 projectors. It wasn't IMAX, but it was 60 millimeters, 35 millimeters like normal movie theater, and then the more advanced is double that, 35, 70 millimeters, sorry. And the trick is, when does it start? How do you sync it with the audio? If the audio is out of frame, like 1 frame or 2, people will notice it, like people talking, and they'll notice that it doesn't match up. The good part we had was that we had multiple projectors. There's a lot of projectors. Every section of the ride was just a very short section. We learned that if you trigger it at the same time, it doesn't get off. The film ramps up to speed. We have a point in the ride where here comes the ride vehicle. The film has to ramp up to speed. It's a mechanical thing. It ramps up to speed. And then when it gets to another point, the audio triggers with the film and it's all synced together. Pretty soon you're out of that scene and it doesn't matter if it's out of sync or anything anymore. It worked pretty well. That worked very well, actually. And then they have recently changed it to, as you know, to digital. They don't have the problems of the film wearing out or running millions of cycles on the film machines.
So I guess speaking of all the different scenes and having the audio sync up, which I think that's pretty interesting. I didn't know that it was actually completely separate, like audio tracks that kind of synced up with the films. But was there any particular scene from like an engineering standpoint that was like maybe the hardest one to conceptualize or work on? Like you talked about the 360-degree base, but was there anything else that stood out as challenging?
We had every kind of special effect. I'll tell you about the most challenging thing, but we had every kind of special effect. We had show action equipment, and they were all triggered. The same kind of ideas. Here comes trigger the special effects. We had show action equipment that was part of the film. I mean, the film was behind it, but you could see the special effect thing in the front. And like the first scene was Spider-Man jumping onto a ladder. The ladder was show action equipment. And then he jumps onto the ladder, and then he jumps on your car, and the car moves after he hits the car. And that whole thing of moving in and moving out is what you want to do with 3D to get that 3D effect. And so that did that very well. But I don't know any particular scene that was a big problem. The one special effect I think that was a problem was we had some fog effects, and I'm not sure exactly what effect it was, but it caused a lot of static electricity that got into the control system and would shut the ride down. And so after the ride was running, it would experience these occasional dropouts, and you would have to evacuate the ride, get all the people off the ride, let's start over, get it going again. Some people blamed that on the control system, and Moog had a decent amount of experience with control systems, marrying PCs with PLCs. And some people thought that it had to be all PLCs. The PCs were causing the problem. So they actually built a new ride vehicle with a control system that was all PLCs. And the issue was the company that made the PLCs didn't have the equipment to do it. They had to design new equipment, which was essentially putting a PC-based equipment in a PLC, so that if you have a ride file that's playing like on a hard drive or something, the PLC has to be able to trigger it to start and stop, and it's got to be fail safe and everything. And so that was very difficult. They got that system to work, and they spent money replacing all the controls on the ride vehicles on the whole ride. And you can imagine how much money that cost and how much consternation that was there between people working on the ride, the vendors that we had trying to develop long-term relationships with. And as it turned out, that wasn't the problem at all. There were sensors along the ride track that monitored where the ride vehicle was. They had cables that went back to the central control system location. And when these cannons went off, these special effects went off, it threw out static electricity that would get onto these cables and go back to the ride control system and cause it to fault. And once they figured that out, they rewired the sensors, how they're wired, instead of, I think they call it a daisy chain, where it goes from one to the other, one to the other. The problem went away. I'm sure now that they build all the new vehicles and stuff, they're built on the same kind of base with the same kind of ride control system. But there was some challenging moments trying to figure out exactly what the problem was to make the ride vehicle as reliable as it could be.
Looking back on the project, is there anything that you wish you could change about it?
The whole thing with the control system, it was a lot of politics involved with that, because there were people that had history in the Disney park, had history in the Universal Park, had history with different control systems, and nobody knew for sure what the answer was. Right? They thought they knew what the answer was, but it turned out they didn't know at all. And so then the company had to try and fix it, and they ended up spending a lot of money on fixing it, which wasn't the problem. I don't know how you could have done it otherwise. I wish that had not happened, because it caused problems between the Universal company and the Moog company, which they don't do a lot of business to each other. In the future, when it came down to building new ride vehicles, they had to go back to Moog to get actuators, because their actuators are the best. They had the strongest, most reliable, fastest, all those kind of things, and nobody else could compete with them on that. So I don't know if they still do that or not.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting, because we've seen the same vehicle design used a lot more recently. We've seen it with Transformers, we've seen it with Jurassic Park.
I would say it's replicating that vehicle for a dark ride. It's hard to beat. In the new park that Universal's building, there are some vehicles that aren't made that way. The Spider-Man vehicle has proven to be a pretty good design. They built the Transformers ride, and they basically copied that vehicle. I know some of the people that worked on the new vehicle, I'm sure they wanted to change it, make it better, whatever. And it's pretty much the same thing. The door still goes up. It's still got the pinch drive system that's above the floor. You don't see any that are below the floor. It just doesn't make good economic sense. I think it's a very good design. They built several Spider-Man attractions. The problem was that the Universal had an agreement with Marvel to have the use of Marvel characters in perpetuity east of the Mississippi. And then Disney comes along and buys Marvel. So if there's one thing that I wish happened back then, Marvel was going bankrupt. I wish Universal had spent their money buying Marvel. Then the sky's the limit and all the attractions they could build based on the Marvel characters. But instead, they bought the land over Lockheed Martin, and it's turned out to be a benefit. They bought it, they sold it. I mean, at the time, it made sense. I don't know how much buying Marvel would have cost, but Disney bought it. And Disney can't make Universal get rid of the Spider-Man ride in Orlando, but I think they probably had something to say about it. I think they had to shut it down in Japan.
Feel like that's still, even to this day, one of the most strange and interesting theme park facts. Disney bought Marvel, and now there's this whole they're having to use Guardians of the Galaxy everywhere because they can't use Marvel.
Yeah.
So you also worked on the Hulk ride.
I did. I took a lot of grief for that too. But I think the proof is in the pudding on both of those rides.
Do you have any advice for those wanting to get into the theme park industry?
The one thing that was a shock to me was that once you've proven yourself, there's no guarantee of continuing employment. I don't know that much about Disney. They may be a little different, but Universal acts like a movie studio. You have a good idea, you get some artists to draw up some storyboards, you sell to somebody that's got some money, you hire some actors and actresses, do a music score, you do all these things. And then when the movie makes it to the movie theater, those people are gone. And in California, they just go to the next movie house, right? They go to Warner Brothers, they go to Disney, they go to Paramount, whatever. But when you're doing a theme park work, where do you go, right? And so unless they have another theme park job, you're out on the street. And the thing that complicates that is the other theme park job is in where? It could be Dubai, it could be Japan, you got to basically move there at some point. There's the early conceptual design phase, but then when it comes down to actually building it, you spend a lot of your life in those areas. I was working for another company and managed the Mummy ride in Singapore. And so I was in Singapore for a while. I know what it's like to be away from home for a while, but I wasn't there away from home for a year. It was months. So it's tough if you get into some of the design things where you actually have to follow through with how it's built and building it in the field, all those things. But if you're okay with that, you're fine. A lot of the people that ended up in the theme park business used to be roadies for road groups like Michael Jackson or Jimmy Buffett or something. They were roadies, I guess the slang term, whatever, that would follow the show around. And when the show's over, it's over. You have to go get on another show. And so those people enjoy that life. They are used to that life. And when they came to work for Universal, they fit right in. They had experience with the show. They had experience with getting things done. They had experience with integrating all the lights, the sound, the this, that, and the other, and managing people to do different things. It's what part of the theme park business you want to be in. Do you want to be in the management part, or you're working in a park and you're managing the day-to-day operations? Do you want to be in the maintenance department where you're maintaining the rides and the shows every day and managing that part? Do you want to be in the food sections or the design part? If you want to be in the design part, it's by project. And if you do a good job and the people you work for like you'll continue to get opportunities to maybe go on to another project. But you have to understand that going on to that other project may probably involve working for somebody else, maybe in a different location. The money benefits and stuff like that help.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what is your favorite part of Islands of Adventure that's not Marvel Superhero Island?
Walking through the entrance of the park and all the Casablanca look to the place. I like walking to the different lands where the music changes. You have a whole different theme and it's seamless. You walk through one park to the other park and it's seamless. So for me, it's not one particular ride. It's not one particular show. It's just experiencing that seamless environment change.
John Rust did a very good job with all the soundtrack stuff with it, getting all that to blend together pretty well.
It's excellent. Interestingly, they hired Bose. They wanted to be involved with the park. And I think they're the ones that did the background hardware. They actually had designed some special speakers and stuff to do what they wanted to do. They weren't experienced in outdoor speakers and things like that, but that was my recollection of what happened. They hired Bose to do the surround sound or whatever sound and all the equipment that went with that.
Oh, that's cool. Very cool. I think it's always interesting hearing all these stories of innovation. And it's just, oh, we needed to do this, so we need to invent that.
Right.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing was just the ride vehicle tilts up, and that's how you don't see the track.
Yeah, the creative guys came up with that because we were arguing about the whole track thing. And I think they could understand that the track underneath the floor was just going to be a nightmare.
So if you could say one thing to theme park enthusiasts who love your work, what would it be?
So Jaws, you'd ride around and they'd be testing the fire effects and all that stuff. And the sharks would come out of the water and scare you. Or they come out of the water. And then we programmed it and you rode around on the ride. And I was quite familiar with the ride, but parts of it did scare me because it was all blended together as far as the show and the fire effects, the motion of the sharks and the Jay Stein guy. He would have everybody turn it up until the fire effects are burning your eyelashes off, literally. Eventually, they turned it down because it cost a lot of money to blow gas every day. but it was a scary thing. And people would ask me about, how do you like working for Universal? And I said, one of the things they did at the end of Jaws was that they hired a bunch of actors and actresses to ride the ride around and make a movie of it. And they all yelled and screamed and acted like they had a good time for the commercials and things like that. But then when you put the general public on it, they would ride the ride, and at the end, they would clap. I said, as a mechanical engineer, I never have anybody clap when I'm done. I never have anybody make a movie of what I've designed and built. I'm lucky to get a thank you, right? The thing I like about the theme park industry, the really payoff at the end, is seeing the general public ride the ride and enjoy what you've been involved with. No matter what piece of the ride or the show you were involved with, you still get a kick out of seeing people enjoy your work. That little thing at the end where you get to see people enjoy the park for the first time, that's a wonderful thing. So that's the part that people will enjoy my work, what piece of it that I did on Spider-Man or the other rides I worked on. That's a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, not only is Spider-Man still around, people are still enjoying it every day, but that same ride system inspired like so many other rides at Universal too, and I think that's like a pretty awesome legacy to have.
I have no regrets about any of that.
Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the 25 years of Islands of Adventure.
Thank you for contacting me and conducting this interview. I enjoyed it.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. For our final adventure, we'll be joined by various content creators to discuss their experience with Islands of Adventure. See you there.